Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Hinenu Baltimore. Thank you, Rabbi Ariana, for inviting me. It is an absolute honor to be a part of your service. When Rabbi Ariana and I were prepping for my joining your service, she told me about the theme of fierce love and rigorous joy and invited me to speak on it, and I'm gonna speak on it. And I've been thinking a lot about joy and grief, and that is the thing I want to speak on tonight, and what joy, what it means to really let it fall apart in our lives. But I'm going to approach it in kind of a circular way, which is that is my way. So bear with me. I'm a martial artist, as many of you know. I practice Aikido, which is both an incredibly disciplined physical practice and also a deeply spiritual practice. And lately I have been asking myself what it takes to truly love our practice, our community of practice, and our spiritual practice, so that the practice that takes root inside of us and that we share with others. Because our practice is what anchors us when hardship inevitably comes. And I've been in pretty deep conversation about this over the last few months in my community, because my own practice community, as all practice communities eventually do, has met its own moment of potential schism, with a rebellious faction advocating for a new direction, and more traditional students, myself among them, who must painfully admit that this new direction is not what we are doing. And these moments of schism come for us all, no matter what our practice is, no matter where we are in the world. The ocean rises, the ocean falls. And difference, particularly difference that means separation, is so painful. It is so painful. But the schism is helping me also to see how much I absolutely love and rely on my community, and how much joy I take in practice. There was a point in my first years of training where it really occurred to me, seemingly apropos of nothing, that joy is the true root of change. This thought literally just arrived and took root inside of me, and the longer I've practiced with it, the more I believe it is true that joy, our experience of joy, is the true root of change in our lives. Because joy helps change take root inside of us. It increases our desire for more change. And so often it is the absence of joy in life and in our practice, or in our practice communities, that help us take pause and redirect ourselves. So the joy I experience in practice helps me to see how much grief I would experience were my practice community to cease to exist or to become unrecognizable to me. I cannot imagine losing my practice community. So this advanced grief makes me feel committed, protective. It makes the experience of practice that much more joyful and precious. So it has been true in my life that joy and grief are the same emotion. They are, I think, the inverse of one another, or perhaps existing within one another, alongside one another, simultaneous to one another, like a multiverse theory of emotion. It's another way of saying, I suppose, that my grief is equal to my love. But for me, there's a deeper reflection available if I consider that they may, in fact, be the same emotion, just traveling along a different axis from one another, or traveling in different directions along the same axis. So again, I'm approaching it in a circular way, but I want to talk to you all tonight about joy in grief, joy in catastrophe, and what that has to do with joy in atonement. So I'll start with this question of how do we take joy in grief? And I can only speak to my own experience of this, which is, for me, maybe also the most simplistic way to approach it. I I had a deep grief experience in 2014 where I lost my fourth child when I was 5 months pregnant. And I'm not going to go into the details of that experience. The thing I want to talk about is the 2-week period immediately after the loss. What I noticed inside of that 2-week period, I was in really the altered state of grief. When those of you who have experienced, which I imagine is almost everyone in this room, anyone who's experienced a deep grief knows what I'm talking about, the altered state of grief. Part of me pressed through the veil between worlds. So part of me very much still alive and here, and part of me not. What I noticed inside of that period was how much joy and connection I experienced. And the joy was not on purpose. It just was what was happening. I wasn't practicing joy. It was just what I was experiencing. I was also sad. I was devastated. But the two emotions were not in opposition to one another. Rather, they were coexisting within me like two bright suns. And in no other moment in my life was it more obvious to me the truth behind this teaching that comes from a Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, this idea that we are fundamentally alone and there's nothing anywhere to hold on to, and it's not a problem. That our suffering is not a problem. So when I think about how do we take joy in grief, for me, the most simplistic way to approach that is to just be with the truth that there is joy in grief, that they actually are the same emotion. So how do we take joy in catastrophe, in times of hardship and crisis? Zooming out, we can look at our current conditions. We're in a catastrophe. We're in a global catastrophe. We have genocide occurring, live streamed. We have the monster of famine and starvation walking the earth. We have climate disaster unfolding everywhere, and the front lines of crisis seem to shift like a murmuration of birds. I hold this in dynamic tension with another truth, that it is well documented that in the aftermath of disaster and catastrophe, people report feeling joy. One of the things that people often talk about after a disaster happens is how much joy they feel. If they survive the immediate disaster itself, the explosion, the bombing, the flood, the tornado, people often report feeling so alive and so joyful and so connected to their neighbors because everyone's primary task suddenly becomes caring for one another. So there are all these ways that disaster, catastrophe, crisis actually force us to reconnect with each other, reconnect with a sense of purpose, reconnect with our most basic needs, and encounter one another fully as people, and encounter one another as resilient, capable, agentic, energetic. And to my mind, because I'm an organizer, that means that the aftermath of disaster is actually an opportunity to reshape relationships, to reshape conditions, to reshape political conditions, to reshape structures. If we take the opportunity of the encounter, if we take the opportunity of crisis to reimagine our relationships with one another. And this brings me finally to this question of how do we take joy in atonement? How do we take joy in making new promises? When Rabbi Ariana and I were talking in the lead up to today, she explained to me that this holiday revolves around the idea of the annulment of vows. And of course, it's a tradition with, as I understand it, many spiritual and historical threads and a lot of complexity because it's Judaism. And she shared with me that part of what's being processed in this season is a fear of breaking the vows we make to God, or a need perhaps to atone for the vows we have broken and release and let go of them. And so to me, this draws me back to the way I'm thinking about what it means to be a part of a community of practice. Because what better time to consider the promises we make to our communities and what those promises have to do with the vows that we make in our spiritual practice. What better time to consider what falling apart has to do with our commitment to practice, with the reshaping and reformation of ourselves and the world. I remember a time in my journey in my martial arts practice when, and it's a strange thing to describe, it's a strange thing to talk about out loud, but I'll take the risk of trying it out. But I remember a point in my practice where I felt I would get onto the mat to practice and I would feel like my body was falling apart. It felt like my body was going to kind of like fly apart into different pieces. And it was very disturbing at the time. Very, very disturbing to my body, to my nervous system. It was very confusing. But when I look back on it, I can understand that it was actually my nervous system, my body literally reshaping itself in response to what I was practicing. Because I've had to retrain my entire body and all of my nervous system responses in order to be a martial artist. That falling apart is making anew. Falling apart is always making anew. So I think perhaps grief and collapse invites us to reimagine the promises we have made to one another, the promises that we have made to ourselves, the practices that we've committed to, and the promises that we made to God. It follows then, to my mind, that to begin reshaping conditions of society, perhaps we must first begin with reshaping the vow that we make to one another. So as I close tonight with gratitude and thanks, I want to invite you in your ongoing reflection tonight through tomorrow to ask yourself, what is a new promise you can make? And not just to yourself, but to your community. What is a new promise, a new vow that you can make? Thank you so much for having me. It has been wonderful and very inspiring to be with you all.